friends. This is the Odd Thoughts podcast. My name is Gunther, and I am your host. And someone that likes to take a general deep dive into the everyday odd thought, the everyday inquiry, or just generally like to go through and research things that I love and talk about the things that I love. And if you're someone that can relate to that, thank you for tuning into the podcast. I appreciate you listening. And I'm bringing to you today episode 4. I've had a lot of fun doing the other episodes so far. I have 3 other episodes. I'm posting them all up on YouTube, so if you want to go check those out, anybody that's listening, I would appreciate that. But today, I'm kind of, I've had a few days in between the last episode, and yesterday was my birthday, and I appreciate any of the love I got, and I had a lot of fun. I turned 27. I'm getting a little old, but I appreciate any love that I get for anytime I get a birthday or anything like that. So, but today I'm finally here bringing you episode 4, and for the first 3 episodes, I kind of took I kind of was a little more. It seems a little more. I was a little more deep on the topics, which is something I really can relate to a lot. And I talked a lot about a lot of personal things, and I try to get a little personal. And I really enjoyed the episodes, and I felt like I kind of tried to convey myself as best as I can, and I'm still learning. So I appreciate the bearing with me. And so today I kind of decided that maybe I'd kind of switch it up. I kind of had a plan to do it maybe episode maybe a couple days earlier, but just kind of got into the flow of a couple things and kind of got distracted over the last couple days. But I had a good topic lined up. It wasn't necessarily the struggle of the topic, but today's episode, I kind of wanted to do something, like I said, a little fun, something that is a little more themed, maybe, if you will. I don't know, a little more, something a little more themed, not so off the top, but I wanted to talk about 3 of my favorite horror movies. It's hard to say, like, my top 3 horror movies, but I want to talk about a couple horror movies or scary movies, if you will, I've been such a big fan of horror movies for my whole life. I was introduced to them at such a young age, and thanks to my older sister, and I fell in love with them. And there's a lot of great experiences I've had watching those movies, and I can confidently say that a lot of my favorite movies are for sure like horror movies, and a lot of my favorite directors have directed horror movies or are horror movie directors. And there's little subtleties throughout the genre. I think sometimes I think you can kind of think of a specific movie when you think of the horror movie genre, whether it be kind of a slasher or maybe a more psychological kind of thriller or something super gory, like, but I try to dabble in a little bit of all the subsets of all the genre, of all the horror genre. But today I wanted to talk about 3 horror movies specifically that I kind of find a lot of enjoyment in. Specifically, I know one of them is my top horror movie, but I kind of, like I said, I just wanted to have a little fun, try it out a little different. And I kind of wanted to maybe try maybe the next couple episodes kind of be kind of these like theme kind of list like this, and I'm just trying to like bounce around and trying to figure out kind of what's good content, or like at least what's kind of fun to talk about. I have a lot of fun talking about a lot of different things, so I'm just seeing what kind of sticks, or at least maybe seeing like where's the flow of like maybe I can like kind of like if I put out however many episodes a week, I can maybe like pick different themes and pick different things to talk about. So, but for today's episode, we're going to talk about my favorite horror movies. And without further ado, I want to jump right into it. But before I jump right into it, like I said, I have all my podcasts posted up on YouTube. This is the 4th episode, so this will be up on YouTube as well. And if you want to go listen to any of the episodes before you listen to that one, that would be great. But if you're still around listening to this one, I'm ready to get into it. I kind of listed them, I guess, kind of chronologically. The first movie I'm going to talk about is for sure my number one, but it just worked like chronologically, kind of. So that's nice, And I don't. Before I even start, spoiler alert as well. If for anybody that's listening, if you haven't seen these movies, like I'm not gonna try to maybe spoil. I'm gonna spoil a little bit, but I'm gonna try to like get behind a little bit of the behind the scenes stuff. Not try to tell too much of the scene for scene stuff, but like some of the behind the scenes stuff, or like maybe some of like kind of like what I think made the movie great, and like what kind of like has impacted like the culture of horror movies, and then maybe like kind of like the tropes that it brought along, and also my personal experience with watching it, and kind of maybe what I thought when I first watched it. So, the first movie on my list is 100%, I would say 100% my favorite horror movie of all time, and that is the original 1978 version of Halloween. I love Halloween. I remember watching it when I was I was like probably 5 years old. My older sister introduced me to it, and I remember falling in love with it. Halloween, yeah, 1978 is when it came out. The director is John Carpenter, and John Carpenter is a fantastic director. He's known in the horror movie genre. He's done a lot of great movies, such as he's done like The Thing, he's done The Fog. He's also done like movies like Big Trouble in Little China, which is 100% one of my favorite movies of all time. And he's also done Escape from LA and Escape from New York and then Escape from LA. That's like the order of things. And if you know anything about John Carpenter absolutely loves putting Kurt Russell in his movies. So it's pretty funny, and I love Kurt Russell, so I'm always okay with that. And he also wrote the movie. He had help with another writer by the name of Deborah Hill, who was like his then girlfriend. They were going out at the time, and she's done a bunch of his movies. They've kind of then formed a partnership, and she like wrote like The Fog, and she wrote Escape from LA, Escape from New York, and she's a fantastic writer in her own right. And they were given kind of like a really cool task to create a really kind of good low budget horror movie. And they got a lot of great people in the movie as well. Jamie Lee Curtis. This was like a very fresh Jamie Lee Curtis. And they also got Donald Pleasance, he plays Dr. Loomis, which is like the doctor that takes care of Michael Myers. And also, but and then the actor they got for Michael Myers was literally like a no name person. Like for sure, his name is Nick Castle, and he would go on to direct movies. He directed like the Dennis the Menace movie with Walter Matthau. I always think of him like in Christopher Lloyd, and then he also did Major Payne, which is it was Damon Wayans, one of the Wayans brothers. And so he done some good movies directing, and it's just funny to think that humble beginnings for kind of some of these people. And also, it also stars it's got PJ Souls, and that's one of Laurie's friends, Linda. And then it also has Nancy Loomis as Annie Brackett, which is one of other Laurie's best friends. And then the Sheriff Brackett, who is Annie's father, is played by Charles Cyphers, which he's a talented actor. And then the little girl that Annie's babysitting is played by a woman named Kyle Richards. And for anybody that's a fan of, I think, the Real Housewives, like one of the series, Kyle Richards was on that. And so it's kind of funny just to how you start from being a little girl in a horror movie to kind of growing up and being on a reality show. It's funny how that kind of comes around. And then another thing I guess to kind of mention is Nurse Chambers, who's a character in the movie, is played by a woman named Nancy Stevens. And the last three actors I mentioned, Charles Cyphers, Kyle Richards, and Nancy Stevens, all came back in like the newer Halloweens that have been made, the David Gordon Green Halloweens. So they got a chance to return, which is pretty cool to see them all these years later come back and reprise their roles. And I think that's kind of what Halloween has always kind of had that kind of feel. And it's Halloween's such a good idea for a movie. It's literally like as we know now, it's kind of become like the cliche, but it kind of started that whole like the babysitter, and all her friends are babysitting on a Halloween night, and a crazy masked killer comes to hunt them all down and kill them one by one, and she barely gets away with her life type thing. And it's a great movie. I don't want to, like I said, I'm trying not to I don't want to give away too many things about, like, I'd rather you someone go watch it, you know what I'm saying? But it's just for the at the time it was made, there wasn't a whole lot of slashers in the genre. There was a couple movies. There was a movie called Black Christmas, which is a very fantastic movie, and then another movie before that called Bloody Night, Silent Night, I think is what it was called. And so it's kind of funny that there just wasn't a lot of slasher movies. It's funny that the only two were Christmas themed, but there just wasn't a lot of slasher movies, and so Halloween is kind of more so given the title of, creating the slasher genre, or at least starting the popularity of the slasher genre. And also a lot of the tropes in the slasher genre. Not like, most importantly, the final girl trope in the slasher genre. Jamie Lee Curtis, Laurie Strode, she's a little bit like, throughout the movie, she's a little helpless, because, and also her character is like very timid and kind of tepid anyways, and so there's a lot of moments in the movie where she's kind of, she's helpless, and so, like, but she does take these certain stands. Like, there's like the one scene, spoiler alert, there's this one scene like where she's in the living room and she gets Michael Myers with the knitting needle, right? Or like the closet scene when she gets him with the hanger, right? There's these certain moments where she's kind of taken back at him, and also, like, taking charge with the kids and tell them to, go run to the houses and do as I say, like, go knock on it, go get help, like, type thing. So she's trying to take control, and that would be kind of become what then the final girl trope in horror movies, slasher movies specifically, kind of became. It was kind of like this at beginning, maybe like this kind of innocence of like being a girl, being a female or whatever, but then like the general coming like to not wanting to roll over and die type scenario, right? I'm gonna stand my ground with my back against the wall and take charge. And that became like the big trope in slasher movies, right? And Halloween started that. It also started the crazy teenagers, the horny teenager trope. When you think about all of Laurie's friends, they're all trying to get laid, or they are getting laid, right? And so they get kind of picked off one by one. And at that time, I know that people, I think, kind of had a problem with it because it was like it was seen as like a violence against sex in a way that like only because these teens were engaging in this is why they were dying. But it was more so, I think, just like the helplessness, the innocence of these teenagers that like they weren't expecting a killer to come in on them, and all of a sudden they're dead. And that's what it was more so about, the Michael Myers being a predator on these people, in that, in a way of just like the innocence of these teenagers, and that was more so what it was. And like the simple fact that then the one sexually repressed girl, the one like non-partier, is the one that survives. And I think people kind of had that. It's like the purity thing, like that's what makes you survive. It's like, no, it's just like like I said, it was always more about like the catching them off guard. And also the kind of like the absent parent, like where the heck are the parents throughout the whole movie? They're, it's Halloween night, so maybe they're at a party or whatever, what I'm saying, living it up. But it's kind of funny to think like there's no parents ever. And when you think about like kind of like behind the scenes of this movie, it really like feeds into the whole atmosphericness of the movie. And the movie was a super low budget movie. It was literally two dudes name one guy's name was Erwin Yablans. He was like a film producer, and a guy named Mustafa Akka was like a financier guy. And they put up like $300,000, and they discovered John Carpenter through one of his other movies, and they said like, hey, let's make this movie this really low budget movie. And John Carpenter was already kind of used to that with his like first movie. Like, yeah, that his first movie was made for like $100,000, and that was like a few years before. So he's already used to that low budgetness, and was given full control right off the bat. He was given not only like the ability, the writing, control, but with directing and also composing the music. So he created the whole atmosphere and really tried to develop, because it's like a bad thing with the low budget, but it's a good thing because when you see the shots in the movies, there's a lot of like shadowed and dark shots, and a lot of things shrouded in the darkness. And I think that that's from like maybe not having all the same equipment, not having all the lighting, or not having all the ability to do these things. And very much so, like not only with like they'd hire like a small crew, but like a lot of the actors were pulling like double duty, basically, like moving things and getting things set up and having to do their own wardrobes. And like I heard something like Jamie Lee Curtis spent like $100 for all her outfits from the movie, and like that was just the vibe. And Michael Myers' mask is literally a William Shatner mask from a costume store that they like widened the eyes out a little bit and then like sprayed white, and just totally like kind of like revamped. And it was very effective, and it creates a spooky feeling. And even though the movie takes place in like a fictional town out in Illinois called Haddonfield, it was filmed in California, which is just funny. So they placed it in the Midwest, but filmed it in California. So there's a couple shots where you can see like palm trees, but most of the time they would like avoid streets that had palm trees and that looked like Midwest towns, and they had actors dressed like it was like the Midwest during the fall, and they used like fake leaves, and they would like reuse the leaves, because of like they just didn't have a lot of money. And what you get out of that, all the kind of that skeleton crew, kind of the low budgetness, and Jamie Lee Curtis got paid like $8,000, and Donald Pleasance was a really big name at the time, and he got paid like $20,000, and so it wasn't much, but they were able to create this incredible movie. And I think also because of the nicheness of the genre, it was they were able to do something with it. And one of the other cool things is John Carpenter had like a fear meter on set, and because a lot of movies film out of the scenes out of like order and stuff like that, that when he would film a scene, he would know like, oh, this is how scared you should be, or like, oh, you don't have to be scared at all. So he would like be like a 6 out of 10 for this scene, or 2 out of 10 for this scene. So he really tried to keep in the continuity fluid, and it doesn't. And sometimes maybe you get a little bit. You could see that in some slasher movies, not the very like C tier ones. You know what I'm saying? You could see that shine through the badness of that. But Halloween achieved something at the time that I don't think a lot of people, had seen before. And obviously, as it was coming into the 80s, this Halloween's from 1978. So it was right before the 80s. And then as the 80s hit, it was like slasher movie haven, right? It's like all movies were slasher movies. And you could thank Halloween for that. And like I said, starting all those tropes and stuff like that. And I always think about like all the things that it was able to do, and like I said, the darkness behind it, and it was really atmospheric. And I think sometimes what makes like slasher movies kind of good is that there's like a real life scenario, like feel to it, in a way of like, we know there are serial killers out there 100%. So when you get these like slasher movies, it's that fear of like a stalker in the night, a predator in the night. And they really did a good job on making Michael Myers, like portraying him as not anything superhuman or supernatural. They kind of made, but kind of leaving it ambiguous in a way. They just wanted to portray him as pure evil. And that was always like the thing behind Michael Myers is like, he was just born evil. He was never like traumatized. It was never abused as a kid. He just like was born evil. And there's always a speech that I think like of Dr. Loomis gives in the movie where he talks about like meeting him for the first time when he met Michael Myers for the first time when he was a kid, and like the darkness behind his eyes and the darkness of his soul, and how he was just like born evil and was laying dormant until something happens, right? And it was just going to be an inevitable thing that something bad was going to happen. And I like that. And also like, he kills a dog in the movie too. And they always talk about like, I was reading something where they're talking about that's they just wanted to drive home the evilness. And then especially even at the end when he gets shot off the balcony, and you see him lying there for a second, but then they like lean over the balcony to go check, and whoop, he's gone. So it kind of leaves that ambiguousness of like, is he human or is he kind of something more supernatural, just a pure spawn of evil? And I remember watching it probably for, like I said, I was probably 5 years old the first time I ever watched it. And my older sister introduced me to it. We had a VHS like of it, and I remember the cover of it was like a facade or like a face of like a pumpkin. And on one of the ridges was like replaced with like the kitchen knife that Michael Myers uses throughout the movie. And it was just like I remember being so vividly watching that movie and just thinking like how it was kind of tamed. It was really like it was spooky, but it was like kind of everything was so tamed, and all the scares kind of came like, came very like slickly. And at the time, like the way they shot the movie with a kind of a Steadicam replica. It's called like a Panaglide, I think, or something like that. But it was how it helped move things through the spaces smoothly. And so you got a lot of that slower, like kind of stalking shots, and there was a lot of like POV shots, which helped you kind of get into the shot. POV shots, which helped you get into the mind of Michael Myers. Sorry, little fumble there. Sorry, but it just really created a good atmosphere, and the low budget I think helped it. But also like you wanted more money because you want to be able to have the ability to do whatever you want. But I think it helped it a lot. And so I've loved that movie forever, and I will always say that that movie is my number one. And John Carpenter is literally one of my number one directors. Like my number one movie in general, I always say is Big Trouble in Little China, and that's always a little goofy to say, but I love John Carpenter, and I love like the pace of that movie, and the fact that he also not only like what he's done in the horror genre, like The Fog is a really great movie, and The Thing is a great movie, and I would 100% recommend go watching those movies. And but if you want to jump into the slasher genre, I think Halloween is so good. I think it's like a really good. Before the really slasher genre kind of gets into that kind of goofiness. I think in the '80s a little bit, or the like the over the topness of the '80s. So that's my number one. I would say 100% that's my number one horror movie of all time. I will always forever watch it. But going on with the list, keeping it like I said, chronological order. The second movie on my list I have is The Evil Dead, and I love that movie. The original one was made in 1981, and it's another movie that kind of is a low budget, but it kind of benefits from that low budgetness. It was directed and written by a man named Sam Raimi. And if anybody knows who Sam Raimi is, he was the man that directed the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, but he also recently did the Multiverse of Madness, the Doctor Strange movie, and he also has done movies like For the Love of the Game, which is a third Kevin Costner baseball movie. He didn't just do Bull Durham, he didn't just do Field of Dreams, but he did For the Love of the Game as well. And then another great movie called the Hudsucker Proxy. If anybody has ever seen that movie, it's got Tim Robbins in it. Yeah, Tim Robbins, yeah. And a fantastic movie, absolutely fantastic movie. So he's very talented. It's everything you always kind of realize that sometimes it does take a little more humble beginnings. Every filmmaker has like an idea, and so they want to like try to get it done, and it always starts like very simply and very like humbly. And that's where Sam Raimi kind of started with The Evil Dead. Him in the main actor in the movie, a man named Bruce Campbell, who plays Ash Williams, who's the main character of the movie. Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi were best friends growing up, and they've been best friends for so long. And so like growing up, watching movies together and making up stories or whatever, it's kind of fun to think about the idea of getting into the business with your best friend. And they had the idea of maybe trying to make this movie of a group of people going out to the woods and some scary stuff like paranormal stuff happens. And originally to get the financing for the movie, they kind of made like a short film, and they wanted to make it was like a way of just like kind of putting the idea out there. And the short film was called Within the Woods. Yeah, Within the Woods. And it was made like a year, maybe a two before they actually filmed The Evil Dead, but they wanted to kind of just like, showcase what the idea was. And Sam Raimi kind of had like a whole like he's always been maybe described in, especially in the earlier years, as someone who's like very kind of fast paced, and he like, he's kind of on the spot, and he kind of wants sometimes he's like flipping up scenes. And so he had this idea of kind of maybe a more of a big budget horror movie, even though that wasn't really a thing at the time, especially in the early 80s. But he was only able to get like a little under 400,000, I think, for the movie. Which, again, if we know, like as we know from Halloween, 300,000 is not that much. And so a couple years later, getting only 100,000 more, it's kind of like wasn't really a lot. And maybe like obviously through inflation, it's different now. It'd be a lot more money, I'm sure, or like a significant amount of more money or whatever. But it was with the idea they had, it was achievable. Excuse me. But they kind of had the same thing behind their movie, behind the Evil Dead, is that kind of with Halloween, is that like it was a very like small crew, and a lot of the actors had to pull double duty type thing. And it's just a good it's a, it's a scary idea for a movie, and they 100% achieved like beyond what you could ever expect from it. It's just like the idea of like a group of friends going out into the middle of the forest on like kind of like a vacation or whatever, and going to this abandoned cabin, but like, believing it to be like kind of like they're gonna try to make it their like, the vacation spot or whatever. And you know they, after kind of spending a little time hanging out, they all of a sudden see a cellar door, and it opens up, and they go down, and they happen to find all this crazy witchcraft stuff, and they get a hold of the Book of the Dead, or or they also call it the Necronomicon, I think is what it's also called. And they start reading from it. It's the early 80s. They didn't know that you couldn't read from mysterious books. So so then it like releases a demon, and it slowly like starts to possess everybody. And it's just funny. It's kind of like in term, it's kind of like just such a, it's like always in horror movies, that silliness of like how basic like the little like steps it takes to like catastrophe like, burst. And like I said, Bruce Campbell's the main character. His name's Ash in the movie. And then his sister is named Cheryl, and that's played by an actress named Ellen Sandweiss, I think is how you say it. And then his girlfriend is a girl named Linda, played by Betsy Baker. And then he also has his friend Scott, which is played by an actor named Richard D. Manincourt. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. And then Scott's girlfriend Shelley, which is played by Teresa Tilly. A bunch of these actors and actresses. I don't think I'm maybe like, I'm so dumb with names a little bit. I can recognize certain faces, but sometimes like there are certain actors that have popped up in movies throughout the years that I just don't recognize. But Bruce Campbell's kind of is the one like character that has stuck throughout the Evil Dead series, and so he's kind of like the main character, and he's the one survives in this movie. He has to like, as everybody turns into what they're called deadites, they're like possessed demon, like zombie looking like things. He has to like kill them, and like it's like, like dismembering them, shooting them with shotguns. And like, he eventually gets like I think in I don't know if it's the first one or the second one, he gets his like hand like taken off, and he like replaces it with like a chainsaw. And the movies get like progressively further into a comedy vibe. Like, but the first Evil Dead is like a straight horror movie, and a lot of those scenes are pretty graphic. I think they really took Sam Raimi and like the crew that they had really took a liking, or took a respect to themselves, and try to create these really good practical effects, especially like I said, with like no money at all. Yeah, and I remember hearing like that, like some of the prosthetics were like literally the cheapest prosthetics. And like one of the characters, she had to wear like a full demon like face mask thing. And when they took like the face mask off, it like ripped off her eyelashes. And then also like when they turn into deadites, they had their eyes turn into a different color. And so they had to wear these contact lenses, but the contact lenses they wore were like thick glass, like just they hurt. And like people were talking about like it was like you couldn't see out of them, and it was like even hard to breathe when you had them on because it was just so stressful. And also like a lot of the crew and a lot of the cast were getting like a lot of injuries and were getting hurt. Like Bruce Campbell seriously like messed up his leg, and there's like an incident where like for one of the scenes to kind of like get Bruce Campbell to kind of act or whatever, Sam Raimi like poked his wound with like a stick and like was like hitting him with the stick and his hurt leg, and it's a little fucked. Sorry, excuse my language, but it's a little messed up. But Sam Raimi was known he was just a young guy and known for being that kind of like quicker pace and kind of doing things like that. And he was described, and especially like he had the vibe of like thinking in like horror movies that like if you don't have your if your actors and like people aren't going through the horrible things, then they're not really it's not a horror movie. And so, like, there was, he wanted a little bit of that actual suffering, right? Without, trying to psychologically mess anybody up too much, but to an effect that I hope he did achieve. And I think he achieved. And it's a great movie. And I would 100% go and check, recommend anybody just to go watch it. But just like, just thinking about all the kind of it's these young filmmakers and a young crew and a young cast and all the comedy of errors behind everything and how, like, you just want to like it's almost like it's like you just want to make it because like people are kind of counting on you, all of a sudden like people gave you this money. And also like throughout the filming of the movie they had to stop multiple times because they needed more money. So it was like a constant thing of battling to try to like get a movie made, and they had to make a lot of their equipment out of just like rig things on trees and branches and try to create shots that they didn't have the technology or maybe more so the budget to get that technology. And so when you get that when you watch the movie, you get that kind of vibe. And it was at the time it was kind of a graphic movie. It would kind of you would see that kind of replicated into the 80s and into the 90s as horror movies were maybe taken you could say taken more seriously, if you will. And it was very much so a graphic movie, a very graphic like movie, and like a lot of the scenes and the idea of also kind of messed of thinking about like having to kill all your friends, like being stuck in this cabin. And also like they tried to escape at one time, and like the bridge like collapsed magically. And like anytime anybody tries to go into the woods, it like the woods attack back and stuff like that. So it's not only like the cabin that's possessed and the people in it, it's like the whole everything around it. So there's like a sense of like helplessness, really, truly, until Ash escapes, and then you get a little bit of like a little bit of a relief, a little bit. And again with the lower budget, it's amazing that what people can achieve. And you don't know at the time maybe how much it might hurt you because you're just trying to think about getting things done, and you need to make it work, and so you need to get things done. And that's what it kind of felt like. And Bruce Campbell always talks about like kind of like how like over all these years that even though it was like a torturous experience, and a lot of the actors share that sentiment, that Sam Raimi is a great director. And and if you ever seen any of the other Sam Raimi's other movies, and you realize that he does have a lot of great directing ability. And obviously they produced something. And like, if you ever watch like the other Evil Dead movies, they're not like the first one. They kind of slowly go into like the comedy kind of like thing. And but it was so it was still one of those things where it was more I think more about just an idea. It wasn't about just trying to make like the craziest horror movie. It's just like trying to portray an idea. And I know that at the time that when they were editing it, it took a long time because they had like a bunch of reshoots, and some of the scenes kind of were like forced together just because of that like Sam Raimi fast paced kind of throwing scenes in style of play. And so like things were a little off. And then there's like a stop motion like part where there's like skin melting off like a skeleton. Yeah, right, yeah, I think in that movie. And that took a long time to edit stop motion. It was something that was kind of still a very popular art at the time, and takes a long time. So they really tediously put this thing together, and as they were pushing it together and showing it, and it was kind of the same thing with Halloween, and it was like these small releases, and they were trying to put out like as anywhere they could, and trying to gain gain over time, kind of gain a following over time. And I think honestly, I think The Evil Dead kind of gained a cult following years later. I think I'm kind of like when the second movie came out, it was still kind of like whatever. Then when the third one came out, which is called Army of Darkness, like I said, it's like more a straight comedy movie. And Bruce Campbell's character Ash like goes back in time into the medieval times, and but it's still like Deadites and like the Necronomicon and stuff like that. But I think that movie kind of brought people. The people were like, oh yeah, The Evil Dead. These are kind of good movies. And the Bruce Campbell charm really turned on. And he also pops up in like a bunch of the Spider-Man movies too. He's like in like the first Spider-Man movie, he's like the wrestling announcer at the when Spider-Man wrestles Bonesaw. You know what I'm saying? Like Bruce Campbell plays the announcer, which is funny. Dude. But I remember probably I think I probably first watched it. I was probably it was a little later. I think I was it was definitely I was probably pre-teenish, maybe like 11. My older sister had The Army of Darkness. Again, my older sister showing me all these movies, and she had The Army of Darkness. And I didn't ever know, like I remember her telling me or someone telling me, I remember telling someone about watching that movie and someone telling me it was part of the Evil Dead series. And I just never knew what the heck that was. And over time, kind of like growing into a horror fan, I kind of started learning about things, and then yeah, I was probably like 12 or 13 when I finally watched The Evil Dead for the first time. I have watched it TV, I'm assuming, something like that, even though it doesn't ever come on TV. But I remember just catching it. It's certain things in my memory just slip sometimes, and I'm so good at some things, but some things I'm just not good at. But I remember watching it, and it kind of has like that outdatedness a little bit, but also like when you kind of sit back and you realize that in the early 80s there wasn't movies like this, that it achieved something. And it's a psychological, kind of messes with you psychologically, and it kind of gives like, and it's in I like the whole deadite thing, and the idea that like you have to kind of turn against people to survive sometimes, and the idea of that spiritual, like the possession of not only the house, the people in the house, the cabin itself, and the woods around the cabin. And it achieved it 100% for me. And I would say I would 100% recommend go watching The Evil Dead. I got watching the whole series, and then all even like they had like a remake like 10 years ago, the Evil Dead remake, and that movie literally I think did is one of the better remakes of horror movies that I've ever seen, because it kept the really creepy, scary vibe, and then also like happened to turn the gore up to like 100,000. There's like a couple scenes in there where you're just like, it's crazy. And that's kind of what the Evil Dead, the goriness wasn't a thing in the early 80s yet. So the Evil Dead tried to achieve something, and a lot of people didn't necessarily want to watch it because of the goriness. We kind of had the luxury of the slower pace slasher, slower pace slasher movies of like the late 70s. And so we kind of get this other kind of movie that's a little more quicker pace. Like a lot of the scenes kind of like it starts out a little slow because and they kind of get to the cabin and they're like smoking a little weed and partying, and then like it's not until they like get into the cellar and then things kind of like ramp up like pretty quick from there. So that's number 2 on my list. Excuse me. I would say that like it's probably maybe it's hard to say maybe that's my number 2 horror movie. Like I said, I kind of like put it in chronological order more so. So like, but I would 100% put it in like a top 5 or top 10 favorite movie of all time. It's just an incredible movie, and Sam Raimi's a great director, and Bruce Campbell, like if you know him kind of in pop culture, he's funny and he's just a good guy, and you realize all the what they went through, just young people trying to make a movie and messing each other up, and they it was always they talk about the torture, but they also talk about the fun they had. That was kind of a big party, and everybody actually like stayed up in the cabin too, and fights would break out and stuff like that, and you get at each other's throats, when you're in a tight and closed cabin all the time. So that's number 2, and on to number 3, I guess. Still staying in chronological order, going back into the slasher genre. Is Yeah, going back into the slash. Sorry, I don't know what I was saying. Going back into the slasher genre is a movie by the name of Scream, and Scream was made in 1996. And the director is Wes Craven, and Wes Craven is not only famous for doing Scream, but he is very famous for doing A Nightmare on Elm Street, and which is like another pioneer in the slasher genre. But he's also did a couple movies before that. Like his first 2 movies in his career are very legendary in my mind, very like legendary kind of cult classic horror movies that in the 2000s they got remakes, and the remakes I think is what people think of. But his first movie, Wes Craven's first movie was Last House on the Left, and that's a great movie. And then his second movie is Hills Have Eyes. I think most people think of like I said, the remakes of those movies, especially The Hills Have Eyes. But his movies are, like I said, they're cult classics. They're 100% these great movies, psychological movies more so, which is kind of what the slasher genre plays into most of the time. And so he 100% aced it with those movies, and also did a Red Eye, which I always laugh at, which is Cillian Murphy and Rich McAdams, another psychological movie. But he got famous for doing A Nightmare on Elm Street. And then the writer for this movie is a man named Kevin Williamson. And Kevin Williamson also, he was kind of doing the slasher genre in general around that time. He also wrote I Know What You Did Last Summer, as well as he wrote the movie The Faculty, or helped write the movie The Faculty, as well as he goes uncredited, but he helped write Halloween H2O, which is funny coming back from going back to Halloween, kind of that connection. And then he would go on to write for Dawson's Creek as well as the Vampire Diaries, which is just funny. Kind of, but staying in like a teenage, just kind of like genre, kind of staying in that teenage genre. But he came up with the idea of the movie one night when he was house sitting for his friend, and he was watching like a 60 Minutes thing or like a true detective, true crime, whatever kind of show. And they were talking about the Gainesville Ripper, and he was kind of freaking himself out, and he kind of was like scared, and he was worried that someone was hiding in the house, and so he called one of his best friends, and talked to his best friend for a few hours, and they were talking about their horror movies, and what a funny thing to be scared out of your mind and to talk about horror movies just to freak your ass out more. Sorry for my language, but then he started talking about like they started talking about like the certain killers in these movies that are kind of like these iconic killers, and that kind of started giving him idea for a horror movie. And then also at the time, there was kind of a thing that was going on with censorship, especially with like TV programming. Bill Clinton was like very strict on like what certain TV, like certain stations or certain movie channels can show and what graphicness they can show. But when it came to the news, there was no censorship as per usual. And so I think Kevin Williamson kind of wanted to make a movie that blended, yeah, the idea of this creepy, like, slasher killer, that kind of stalks his prey, but also the idea of like this glamorization of crime or like this glamorization of specifically like murders. How like, seemingly like these like serial killers become celebrities overnight in all the worst ways. So he got to writing, and originally the movie, it's so funny. Originally the movie was called Scary Movie, which eventually the parody Scary Movies, those movies like came out, and the first Scary Movie parody Scream. Just funny. It's just kind, it's funny. But he made a very meta kind of horror movie. And he was selling it to all these like different like studios, and eventually Miramax and Dimensions would buy it out for like $500,000 or something like that. And if you know anything about Miramax or yeah, Miramax, it was owned by the Weidenstein brothers. Sorry. And but he made a lot of money, and it was kind of a bidding war from it. And then it started the hunt for who's going to direct it. And one of the names that popped up was both Sam Raimi and John Carpenter because of what they established in the horror genre at the time, and just being great directors and kind of going on to direct other style of movies that people love. And so they kind of were bouncing around, and Kevin Williamson kind of took a stab in the dark and decided to send it to Wes Craven, thinking that Wes Craven was kind of gonna maybe shoot it down. Like I think he kind of had it in his head that Wes Craven was maybe like just gonna like shit on it and like send it back and ripped up type thing. But Wes Craven liked it, and Wes Craven just kind of grammar fixed his grammar and kind of gave him some notes about like keeping the certain pace of like a horror movie, and then it just became so that Wes Craven wanted to do the movie. And when you tie that name, when you tie like especially with his legend behind Nightmare on Elm Street, you kind of know that he has like a establishedness in the slasher genre. So you get a big name behind it, and all of a sudden you start putting in all these famous actors and actresses. You got Neve Campbell who plays Sydney, and then you got David Arquette plays Officer Dewey, and then you got Courtney Cox plays Gail Weathers, which like literally the best reporter name in the world. And then Matthew Lillard playing Stu, Skeet Ulrich playing Billy, which is Sydney's girlfriend or boyfriend. Sorry. And then Tatum, who's played by Rose McGowan, which is Sydney's best friend. Just it's like the random little bits, and then literally Liev Schreiber plays Cotton Weary, which he comes back in like later movies, but literally just like a little slick little cameo there. And then Henry Winkler plays the principal, which I think is just funny to throw Henry Winkler in there. And then Linda Blair plays like a reporter, and Linda Blair is the Exorcist. She's Reagan from The Exorcist, the girl from The Exorcist. So literally just throwing in these little cameos, and at the time picking young stars, but people who are 100% ready, I think, for like a jump and who had done things but were ready for a jump in their careers. And I think you get a lot of great performances. And it kind of and it literally is like a movie that, like I said, so meta that it plays into those tropes. It's literally like this, girl and her friends who get hunted out by a killer, and everybody starts getting eliminated one by one, and it causes a frenzy around the school, and everybody kind of starts pointing fingers, and it comes on the wake of Sydney's mom's death the year before, and so it kind of has like this significance, and there's really this driving home of like how affecting it is to everybody, and everybody starts to get one by one killed off until the reveal of the killers at the end. And that's, I think, it was what kind of made it different, and that's what made it more so meta. Is like you get these reveals of the killers throughout all the slasher genre, but you don't get killers revealing themselves necessarily. It's always like a build up to the reveal. Like when Michael Myers was killing people, they didn't know it was Michael Myers until like, they kind of discover it's him until Dr. Loomis lets everybody know. They don't know it's Jason Voorhees until like they start talking about the legend and you start connecting in the behind the scenes, behind the dots type thing. Like they never really outrightly say it's Jason until like you start connecting the dots yourself. And then Nightmare on Elm Street, until you start knowing Freddy Krueger was like a guy that worked at like a daycare or like a preschool, was abusing kids, then you kind of learn his backstory. But in this movie, the killers make themselves known, they at the end. And I kind of like the whole like idea of like the pointing fingers thing, and that's what you get a lot throughout the movie. And Jamie Kennedy's also in the movie, and his character's name is Randy. And his character is like the whole like pushing of that meta, like given the rules of horror movies, don't do drugs, don't have sex, don't say you're going to be back because you're definitely not going to be back. And, he's got all these rules. Everybody's a suspect, like, I think that kind of, it brings this like, dialogue on throughout the whole movie that it's a very self-aware horror movie. Like all the things that happen are exactly what happen in horror movies, but with a little bit of a fresher twist on it and a little more of like a play into the psychologicalness. And then when you get to the reveal of the killers at the end of the movie, who are Billy and Stu, and is Sydney's boyfriend, and Stu is Billy's best friend. When you get into the reveal, you realize like this psychotic break that both these characters have had. Billy's dad left his mom, and that kind of tore Billy apart. And Billy always suspected that his dad had slept with Sydney's mom because Sydney's mom was expected to be like a whore, basically. And so like he kind of built up this thing, especially when they're supposed to be teenagers. Obviously, they're all like adults in the movies, but they're supposed to be teenagers. But like you kind of think that like this psyche that this kid has built, and he's convinced himself that this is the one thing that's true. And like you don't ever know until maybe like in the later movies that maybe Sydney's mom did possibly sleep with Billy's dad, and that's kind of what happened. But you don't know in the first movie. And so you kind of get this idea that this kid has just built this up in his head and it has been sitting and waiting and festering and holding out this animosity and like he was only dating Sydney to get close to his Sydney's mom and like he was gonna get his revenge on Sydney and like Sydney's dad and stuff like that. And so you start to really realize that breakdown. And then Stu, his I think is like even more psychotic because he's just doing it out of like the love of Billy. He has like this idolization of Billy and he kind of being convinced by from his best friend that this is what it is. And Stu's character is always made to be kind of like a maniac, kind of manic and kind of like an eccentric, kind of out there and doing whatever he wants and like it's always a spur of the moment type thing. You never know when it's gonna come down. And so like he was just along for the ride. And also like I've always read that kind of behind the scenes that there was kind of maybe a gay relationship, which they make fun of in Scary Movie, or like they kind of allude to, not make fun of kind of, but like they allude to, and or at least that there's like some sort of like homoerotic obsession that Stu has with Billy more so. But then you like it's a breakdown, when their whole like reveal, and it's like the whole breakdown of their plan, and you're like, God dang, and like the whole idea of like they're gonna frame all these murders on Sydney's dad and then they're gonna stab themselves and then be the survivors, to be the final, people. And that, like I said, that was the sentiment behind the news at the time. There was like this glamorization, especially with like a string of murders, mass murders in the news at that time. The sensationalization, sorry, of serial killers and of crime in general, and that lack of censorship in the news. And I think and they always kind of allude to that like idea that it's like horror movies aren't what fuck people up. It's like it's censoring horror movies. It's letting people actually not be able to get their creativity out on watching these fake movies, but then actually having to go get their need through the real world, which was kind of it's kind of a far-fetched idea, but also kind of that it is a good idea where like, if you take everything out of that creativeness, then they're gonna have to go search somewhere else. And even though their motive is not good, and obviously they get the karma for it, I think it very much so it was at the time is what it was. And when that movie was released, I think a lot of people also had problems, especially with the following things that would happen in the next few years, like Columbine. And I think that movie always came into question, and an idea that it was promoting violence towards teenagers, that it was like promoting that this is something that is okay, that like honestly, like you could do this type thing. And it was, but it was never them saying that. It was just a horror movie, but it was so. And if you ever watch it, it's so like meta, and it's never like taking itself so seriously that like someone would watch that and be like, oh man, I think I probably could have done it better, type thing. It's very much so making fun of the horror movie genre in general. And and it did a lot of great things playing into those tropes too. And I think it really transformed specifically like the final girl trope. It kind of like Sydney really is like a badass. There's like a couple scenes where she's fighting back, and like at the end, she comes pops out the closet with like the umbrella and like stabs Billy or like shoots Billy in the head, and like like dumps the TV on Stu's head. Like so she takes the final girl trope up to 10. Excuse me, sorry. But that it's kind of what Wes Craven likes to do too. Wes Craven in a Nightmare on Elm Street in his first one, Nancy, his main character Nancy, same thing. She's kind of worried at first. She's a little scared because she doesn't know who Freddy Krueger is. But then eventually it's like she's like, we gotta take Freddy Krueger out the nightmares and kill him in the real world. So you're like, man, that's badass. And so he just does it again. Creates another badass like female character. More so, I guess, on Kevin Williamson creating that character. But and also it's also playing into like it's literally like making these teenagers like the typical like because there's a party and that's when everything goes down is like really when the whole like resolution of the whole like thing is at the house party at Stu's house at the end and it literally playing into all those tropes, party and everybody's getting drunk and everybody's off their game and it's more so like playing on the innocence, not that they should be preyed on because of these things, but that they're just not paying attention and they wouldn't expect a killer to come pop in and all of a sudden take them out type thing. And also, all the female characters, I guess, are kind of badass in this. Are kind of cool. Like Gail Weathers, even like she has her moments, and before Tatum dies, she throws like the bottle at Ghostface, and she tries to get away. And even like the men are more weak. Like Randy gets shot, and he's kind of like out for a second. And Dewey, every movie, David Arquette's character, Officer Dewey, gets like messed up, just messed up. So it's what happens, and Cindy just becomes more like that final girl, like girl boss kind of girl, kind of the trope that like has been in slasher movies for a long time, but I think they did it best. And it brought back the slasher movie genre in general. And at that time, movies started popping up like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Halloween H2O would pop up, and like a bunch of like little like it's also kind of like holiday horror, like themed horror movies kind of were popping up, which is funny. But it kind of brought that like slasher movie genre and also brought back kind of a meta-ness to it and really started playing into those tropes heavy. And I think that also maybe hurt it a little bit because then that was like, and when remakes started happening, they like took the tropes from those movies and just turned it on to 10 because that's what everybody has like that nostalgia. But like, we 100% got a revamp when Scream came out. And at the time, like I said, people had problems with it just because they thought it was inciting some sort of violence and with the like things that were happening at the time, especially in the news. Like I said, the glamorization of like killers in the news and murdering on the news, like it was one of those things where people had problems. But at the end of the day, everybody that made that movie always kind of, and especially like Wes Craven, always said like, why would you censor something? We're just like, we're making a statement. We made something creative. We did it good. Like, why wouldn't you want to show people? And I think everybody did have that tepidness of like, it could just flop because like nobody's gonna want to hear this stuff and nobody's gonna want to watch this stuff. And I think there was maybe a little bit of that feel until eventually everybody loves it. And I think Scream is now, especially like with the newer ones coming out, as everybody comes back and realizes that this is kind of like, especially my generation, this is kind of our slasher movies. Like these are our like, at home, this is what hits home for us. And like I said, bringing back the slasher genre, beautiful stuff. All right. I've been talking for a little while. This is a little longer episode. I wanted to do something a little funner. Like I said, I did three of my favorite horror movies, and I've got like such a long list of horror movies, and so many more I can talk about. And if anybody wants to hear that, let me know. I'm always willing to do more parts. Like I'll try to space it out. I'm not gonna do a part two maybe too soon. I kind of maybe even want to try to bring on like my older sister and do a part two. Talk about some of our like movies we like to watch together. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, I'm gonna stop talking. I appreciate y'all listening though. I wanted to do a little bit of a different idea, like I said, and I think I'm gonna try to get the next few episodes kind of be the same thing. Like maybe do kind of some of these like top three, like or this, or like things like I think like the next episode. I think I was talking about in episode three. I wanted to do like things in like pop culture or pop media or like popular media that have turned 25 this year or like are approaching 25. Which that's a quarter century. That's a pretty good mark. And there's like movies and songs and stuff like that. So I think that would be kind of a kind of a fun idea, or maybe in like things that came out in 1996 when I was born. That'd be kind of a good idea. But anyways, yeah, I'm gonna kind of keep this outro short, so I'm gonna cut it off right now. I appreciate anybody who's listening to the podcast. I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And for anybody that like wants to suggest anything, also I always take that too. I'm trying to work on the social media thing and trying to work on a schedule, and I want engagement. So if anybody, if anybody ever makes it to the end of these podcasts and hears this, just send me something, or just show me a little love. Like I'd show someone, I'm just trying to get it out there, and more so about trying to get my voice out there and trying to gain confidence with it. But anyways, this has been the Odd Thoughts podcast. I have been your host Gunther Getlicker, and I appreciate y'all stopping by. And I just want to tell everybody, be excellent to each other.